What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that has leadership in its sights. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the Prime Minister, whoever that might be when this podcast goes out. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make Britain work. We discuss everything from the latest Forex numbers for sterling and the euro to the latest announcements from the Chinese Politburo, and of course, the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by David Williams, Director of Impact. Founded with the intention of using adventure as a catalyst for individual development, they have done everything from helping young offenders turn themselves around, trained deputies at the National Coal Board, and helped equip civil servants with the leadership skills required to privatise British Telecom. David co-founded Impact in 1980 and now inspires people across the globe with over 200 colleagues working in the UK, Europe, North America and Asia Pacific. We discuss how the business has grown, the lessons learned, and naturally, the importance of leadership more generally. David, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for joining us today. And it's been a fair few months, obviously, since Impact has been in the review. I think we are a wonderful place to start, and the listeners would appreciate, I think, to know what you, the teams, I should say, at Impact have been up to since.
Well, the organisation continues to grow steadily but surely. So we've been focusing upon a few of our overseas offices over the last few months, specifically America and Asia. And we're very pleased to say that we've been winning some fairly significant contracts out there for leadership development in both the private sector and public sector.
Superb. And so it's busy, no doubt. And listeners will know, obviously, at the fantastic growth that Impact has had over the years. But before we get there, we should probably start at the beginning. And not everyone might know that, David, you founded the firm now back in 1980. And the inspiration behind the business is quite a personal one, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So, as you say, I started the business in 1980. Next year is our 40th anniversary. So it's been a lifetime's work, you could say. And it all began when I was 16, and I was lucky enough to be sent on a 4-week outward bound course. Now, I know the words outward bound are bandied around for anything to do with the outdoors, but actually there's only one outward bound organisation.
Yes.
And I went and spent 4 weeks with them at a place called Aberdyfi in Wales. I went in there very shy, unsure of what I wanted to do with my life, and I came out having done things I'd never done before, having developed levels of confidence I didn't think I had, able to relate to people in a much more useful and productive way than I had before. And it inspired me to try and do similar work to the work that people had been doing with me during that experience.
And the rest is history, as they
That's right, yeah.
say. And it's a terrific story and an important one, I think, in dealing with so many individuals that you've done over the years. To have a foundation like that is such an important one. And it's fair to say that Impact is unique in its approach. And to the outsider, maybe to those that are more unfamiliar, David, what is it that you would say that your teams do that raises them above the others out there?
Well, I guess, first of all, we're privately owned. And I think that is quite important, quite unique, because in the modern day world, many organisations who are operating in our sector have consolidated into quite large organisations, and I think that kind of level of personal approach is lost through that journey. So even though we've grown over the last 40 years, we still feel like a family business. We still feel like a very small organisation, even though we employ 250 people. I think what makes us unique is we're an organisation that starts with helping people to become the best versions of themselves and helping them to work more effectively with other people to achieve results. And that's the kind of unwritten motto that we take to every piece of work that we do.
Superb. And I know, obviously, an impact in yourself, David, firm believer that, as you said in your article, in fact, leadership can be learned and it can be improved on. What are the key?
Absolutely.
And I think that really is the key point from you. And what would you say about that? But also, what are the traits you would look for in people that you work with that might not naturally themselves think that they are a leader?
Well, I think that's one of the mistaken philosophies that we've pursued for such a long time now, trying to look for traits in a person, leadership traits in a person, trying to look for people who are emulating other people who've perhaps been successful as leaders in their own right. And what we start with is the individual, and we're looking for authenticity. So we're looking for each individual to develop their own personality in such a way that they can use what is essentially theirs to become more effective as a leader. And the reason this can be a taught skill is because it's quite simply about, first of all, developing an awareness of when leadership is required. So we call that noticing. And then when there's a leadership vacuum or when there's a need for someone to step in and take the lead, we call that noticing. So it's noticing what is needed and noticing what's required, and then making a decision about what kind of action is required, and then having the courage to take that action. So all of those skills are learnable, and we typically create environments where there are vacuums for leadership that people first of all recognize, they notice, they then decide what they need to do, and then they have the courage to take the action.
And a fantastic approach, and one that clearly works, not least because the fantastic growth, and I mentioned, of course, Impact Now, with 17 offices all over the world. And I think the reason why that approach obviously is important, in whether it's the west coast of the United States, Japan, Australia, or indeed where you are in the Lake District, there are cultural differences. And how have you found, as the business has expanded, have you found that those core principles that you've just described can be and are applicable to all societies that you work with?
That's correct, yes. And in fact, Japan was our first overseas office. So
Really?
We started the organisation here in the Lake District in the north of England, and this is our global headquarters. But our first overseas venture was in Japan, what I thought was a very, very different culture at the time. And we went through a huge period of time reviewing how we operate, looking at how we work, and testing that out in the Japanese market to make sure it was working. The beauty of our approach, which is essentially about experiential learning, is that you're creating environments in which people can learn from their own experience. So that is completely capable of being culturally normed. And we try to find local facilitators wherever we operate. So there's no language barrier, and there's also an understanding of local nuance.
Good.
But the approach we take is pretty consistent right the way across the world, and that's all about designing experiences that people can go through, can learn from, and then through skillful facilitation can extract from those experiences what they need most to become a more effective leader.
Wonderful. And clearly that's something that has proved invaluable to the business. And stepping away, though, from perhaps the business itself, David, and looking more broadly at what you do and the broader market, what would you identify right now as perhaps the challenges that you're facing in the medium term?
I think it's a great question. I think we've always been challenged as we've moved forward, so 40 years of experience we've seen, especially in the UK, lots and lots of change. We were very active in privatisation days, helping people who are essentially coming from a civil servant background become more entrepreneurial managers. And I think currently what we're seeing are three main drivers that are opportunities, if you like, for good leadership, and are markets that we're very keen to get more heavily involved with. The first one is that experiential learning can happen in a digital and high technology framework. So we've created our own experiential learning platform. So we're able to perform virtually with a number of our clients now, whereas before it would always have been face-to-face.
That is interesting because it's very much, I think, especially with Impact, very much associated, I think, with the human touch, being with each other. And it is fantastic then that going forward, technology can be used very usefully then with your strategies.
That's right. And we looked around the market and we couldn't find a platform that would do what we needed it to do. Technology is great, but it can be quite limiting when it comes to real social interaction, which is the basis of our work. So we created this platform to enable us to actually connect with people in a very real and authentic way, and to kind of send out challenges that people participate in the real world, and then they come back to the platform to review and be facilitated as they develop their own learning from that. So that's one challenge that we're responding to at the moment. I think the second greatest challenge is the pace of change. So organisations that aren't changing are effectively dying.
Quite.
And so we have, I think, a lot to offer organisations that are going through rapid transformation or being disrupted by technology, and helping their people to stay in a place where they can cope with the pace of change and feel like it's something they can influence, as opposed to it feeling like it's something that's been done to them. And the third area, and the most exciting area, I think, is I think business has a massive part to play in the creation of a more sustainable future for all of us. And I think this can be done as part of profit-making activity. So we launched about 3 or 4 years ago now an initiative called Sustainable Innovation. And this is where we're working with teams within organisations to help them recognise how their products and services could be refined to actually achieve some positive changes in the world, whether that's environmental or community-organised, community-based, and helping them to release the brilliance they have in their organisation, because all of us essentially want to be part of a more sustainable future, and businesses offer a fantastic opportunity to do that using the skill sets they already have to move things forward quickly.
It really is quite an exciting time in that case, and who's to say where we'll be on those fronts in, I'd say 10 years, maybe even 5 would be hard to predict. And quite interesting, actually, you bring up the work you did, David, with the civil service in the 1980s as privatisation occurred, where there may well be a very similar, or certainly comparable event now, that if, for example, and I'm afraid we can't get away without talking about Brexit, I'm sorry to bring it up, David, but for example, for the last 40 years, this country has not had any trade negotiators, because it's done at European level, and it will be interesting to see which individuals, which people the civil service can call upon to talk to the Americans, the Japanese, who have quite a lot of experience in this particular skill set. And that'll be something, I think, that you will need certain leadership qualities to be able to handle.
Absolutely. And I would like to see more investment from the government in the civil service and in the skills the civil service need to develop. When we first started our business, we were much more heavily involved with government departments and organisations within government. And I think I think you're right in identifying that there needs to be a new phase of investment there to develop the skills that perhaps we've lost as we've become more closely aligned to the Europeans.
Now, as we are speaking in the midst of a general election, and listeners know we're speaking on the Thursday before, so in 1 week's time, we'll probably know who'll be forming the next government. It's often said that over the years, this country has had a fair number of quite decisive and headstrong leaders, and they cannot be identified. A lot of people over the last 3.5 years or so, since the referendum, have rather felt we've been rudderless on that front. And while business continues and the economy grows, and there's an ever-growing list of entrepreneurs, especially young entrepreneurs, who show leadership qualities, has it, David, and you may disagree, but how do you think it's been lacking in our political class in more recent times?
Well, I suppose the health warning first off is that we try and create an environment here at work where neither religion nor politics are discussed in an open conversation.
Good policy.
Because people have so many different and varied views on that.
Yes.
But from a leadership perspective, I think having talked to thousands of people in the UK over the past few years, there's definitely a sense of confusion, a sense of lack of momentum, in that things seem to have stalled to a greater extent since the referendum. And I think there's also, unfortunately, a massive loss in trust of politicians. And so I think we have our work cut out to return to a place where the British people have confidence in whoever is in the government at the time. And that's not helped by some of the pantomime that we experience when we look at government debates, when we look at how they go about doing their business. So without being critical of any particular party or any particular individual, I do think there is a huge gap of leadership at the moment in our parliamentary affairs. And I think that needs to be addressed with the right kinds of experiences, ones where personal ambition and personal agendas are put to one side for the common good. And that is exactly how we work with senior teams in business. The same issues can often be rife within the top teams of organisations, but they have to be resolved for the good of the organisation itself. And I think that's what's required at the moment in Parliament, if I'm honest.
Well, I think you speak on behalf of the nation there, David. But I'm conscious of the time. We should return back to Impact, I think, as we finish up here. Obviously, you must be, quite rightly, exceptionally proud of what you have created, this now international success. What are the plans for the next 12 months or so, and indeed further?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, next year is our 40th anniversary, so we're using that as an opportunity to really review and reflect upon what we've achieved, and a little bit of celebration will probably be in order.
Quite right.
But at the same time, we are looking at refreshing our strategy and looking at where we would like to go and what we would like to do in the future. And I guess, when you get to the age I'm at, having built and grown a business for the period of time that I have, I'm really keen that we are recognised more widely in the world for the good that we do. And so we'll be kind of accelerating and emphasising a lot more of that going forwards, and looking for places that we can engage with from the point of view of actually making a positive change in the world, whether that's using business or not-for-profits or the public sector to work with as partners on that.
Is the future is clearly going to be exceptionally exciting, especially on that sustainability front. And if I may ask, David, as a last question, What would you say, given you're approaching your 40th anniversary of the business, what would you say to those young people out there who are thinking about starting their own businesses in any sector that listen to this? What advice would you give them for ensuring that perhaps in 40 years' time they can be celebrating their 40th anniversary of their company?
Well, I guess, I'm a massive advocate of experiential learning, and experience starts with making a decision to have an experience. Yes. So the only advice I would give is if you've got an idea that you think you can build a business around, then just do it. If it's not working, fail fast and try something else. But there's too much prevarication, and you just need to start it. I had absolutely nothing when we started Impact, and if you're passionate about something, that passion will help you to create a business. It will help you to attract clients, and it will help you to attract other people, other like-minded people who want to work with you on the journey.
Fine words to finish on it. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with David, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Impact are continuing to raise standards. I certainly let David know we'd all rather be by Lake Windermere than stuck down here in Westminster. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist. That's flags to you and me. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to Eric. Here it is now. Eric, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of No, I don't want to do that. No. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything, but there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something. And it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on. I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Control Act will take place. So as we speak, we don't quite know. As perhaps like the government front bench don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without making amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40 odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. if there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December, something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it does quite shock them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we were left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, oh no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as you correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition that claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments that introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You were, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshirean, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? You hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I've found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership. Well, I always used
to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you all know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay for to be members, and it's a way of not being beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said, what some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Oh, absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I'll join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to us. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story. Most people might guess that a dialogue Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
I'd Che Guevara.
Which
I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Bunk was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives would never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with, of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, for something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realised that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It was on the basis of getting people into jobs. It was about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down for being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continuing with the government's anti-corruption champion shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying that the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress it. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old maids cycling to evensong and warband. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit of stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
I think it very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let listeners know what projects you are working on with that and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country?
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, so many years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. It's something I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine you were actually very content and happy because the former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you came quite unscathed from it.
I came out, he was very nice about it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out one or two of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time, but I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy. and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years, and it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle. Those have been left behind by our economic progress, and it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know that's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Because thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the horse and stables to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry, or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.